The Grand Chamber of Galactic Command was a spectacle of grandeur and tension, a vast arena that spanned the length of 4 Terran football fields and shimmered with the energy of 1,000 different technologies. Beings of all shapes, sizes, and states of matter filled the chamber, suspended in levitating pods, reclining on gravity-resistant cushions, or shifting restlessly in shimmering light cocoons. They had come from every corner of the galaxy, their expressions ranging from curious to deeply suspicious. At the heart of the chamber, beneath the spotlight that accentuated every crease in his weary face, stood Dr. William Marsden. His crisp white coat was a stark contrast against the colorful chaos around him, but Marsden felt anything but commanding. He was a surgeon, not a politician, and standing here under the scrutiny of hundreds of alien eyes made him feel like a specimen on display. The Lyratech ambassador, Valoon, floated above him in a crystalline pod that glowed softly with her species' characteristic bioluminescence. With 8 delicate limbs outstretched, she radiated authority. Esteemed beings of Galactic Command, she began, her voice resonating with a harmonic quality that made every syllable linger. We are gathered to address a matter that has raised grave concerns across our coalition. It is time we confront the practices of human surgery. The final word, uttered with a mix of disdain and disbelief, sent ripples of murmurs through the chamber. Valoon allowed the reaction to settle before continuing. Humans, unique as they are, cling to practices that involve physical invasion, cutting open living bodies, manipulating organs with crude implements, and sealing wounds with cauterization and threads. It is a barbaric relic of their past. The Kroll-Core, a massive insectoid species with iridescent wings and mandibles that clicked rhythmically, erupted in a cacophony of agreement. Closer to the center, a cluster of gaseous nebulith shifted hues from neutral green to a sharp, angry red. Even the normally stoic sascar, a reptilian species known for their inscrutable expressions, hissed softly. Marsden took a slow breath, schooling himself to calm. He had anticipated the hostility but hadn't expected such visceral reactions. Ambassador Valoon, he said, his voice steady, though he felt the weight of every gaze upon him, I understand that to many of you, our methods may seem primitive, but surgery is a precise, controlled intervention used only when no other alternative exists. It is the last defense against death. Controlled, echoed Valoon, her bioluminescence flaring with incredulity. You slice and sew like primitive crafters. How can this be control? The chamber's translator emitted a low hum as Marsden's words were processed for the assembled species. He resisted the urge to rub his temples. When molecular reweaving fails, when energy field manipulation proves ineffective, when a life hangs by a thread sometimes, controlled physical intervention is the only option. I have witnessed lives saved through these means when all else failed. Binnell, a gelatinous being encased in a transparent sphere, surged forward, emitting gurgling sounds of disagreement that were quickly translated. Our reweaving technology corrects cellular damage without the need to pierce flesh. Your approach is born of desperation and base instincts. Marsden's jaw clenched, but his voice remained level. Your reweaving technology is impressive, but incompatible with many species including humans. When one of our own suffers severe trauma, no amount of molecular reweaving will save them. We adapt because we must. A hologram suddenly flickered to life above the chamber, displaying a 3-dimensional image of a human surgical procedure in graphic detail, a chest cavity opened, delicate organs handled with care, arteries sutured shut. It was meant to educate, but the effect was immediate revulsion. Several species emitted noises of shock and dismay. The nebulith turned an even darker red, while the Kroll-Core's wings rattled furiously. Valoon raised a glowing limb to silence the outcry. You see, esteemed members, this is what they call healing. Marsden swallowed hard. He knew this would be the reaction, but he wasn't here to cower. To those unfamiliar, it must look barbaric. But every day it saves lives. If you doubt me, I invite you to visit any of our hospitals. Speak to the mothers whose children are still alive because of surgery. Talk to those who can walk again, who can breathe again. A hush fell over the chamber. Marsden had struck a nerve, the shared fear of mortality, the desire to protect those they loved. For some, it resonated. For others, it only deepened their mistrust. The sascar counselor, Ralden Voas spoke next, his voice a low, rumbling hiss. You ask us to accept your methods, human, but what guarantee do we have that your precision is not a mask for unnecessary harm? Marsden met Ralden's reptilian gaze. I can only offer evidence thousands of lives saved against all odds. But there is no guarantee in medicine, no method, not even yours, is without risk. The chamber erupted again, this time with more tempered debate. Marsden could see that some representatives were listening, even if begrudgingly. Others would never be convinced. He turned to Ambassador Valoon. I don't expect you to accept our methods without skepticism, but I ask you, when every other option fails, will you condemn a life to death because you find our tools distasteful? The question hung in the air, stark and unyielding. Valoon's glow dimmed slightly, a sign of uncertainty. Human, she said slowly, we must vote. But know that our concerns are not rooted solely in aesthetics, they are rooted in ethics. Marsden inclined his head, and so are ours.
The vote proceeded as expected. Human surgical methods were to remain restricted to emergency-only situations, under stringent oversight. Some regarded the decision as a victory, others saw it as a grim compromise. Marsden left the chamber with heavy steps, knowing this battle was far from over. But he had seen a flicker of doubt in their eyes, a crack in the wall of prejudice. It was enough to keep him going.
2 months had passed since Dr. William Marsden's tense encounter with Galactic Command. The verdict had been clear: human surgery would be relegated to emergency-only status under tight scrutiny. On paper, it was a compromise, but in practice, it was little more than a banishment to the margins. Marsden returned to his work on Earth, alternating between cutting-edge procedures and training sessions for new recruits, though the weight of the decision lingered. His routine was shattered one afternoon by a priority call from the Sascar Empire. The tone was urgent, the request unmistakable. Emperor Haldus Vora, the revered leader of the Sascar, lay dying. He had suffered catastrophic injuries, and a ceremonial disaster, an elaborate crystalline structure, had collapsed during a grand parade, piercing his body with hundreds of jagged shards. No known sascarian regenerative or molecular treatments had succeeded. If Marsden refused or failed, it would mean more than the death of a ruler. It could destabilize one of the galaxy's major powers.
Within hours, Marsden and his team were on a high-speed medical cruiser, speeding toward Drellian Prime, the Sascar homeworld. He reviewed the Emperor's condition on the ship's holographic display: deep puncture wounds, severed arteries, and internal organs perilously close to failing. The scan showed a daunting challenge, but one he had to face head-on.
As their vessel broke through Drellian Prime's atmosphere, Marsden caught his first glimpse of the planet, a world of stark beauty, its sky tinged orange by crystalline spires that stretched toward the clouds. Sascarian architecture was a blend of jagged elegance and natural splendor, but now those towering structures seemed to loom like ominous sentinels. At the Imperial Palace, Marsden was met by a delegation of Sascar officials. Leading them was Ralden Voas, the counselor who had once voiced his disdain for human methods in the Grand Chamber. His scales, normally a burnished bronze, appeared dull and worn. Human Ralden greeted him, his voice taut. Know this: if you fail, you will answer to more than just history. Marsden nodded, unfazed by the thinly veiled threat. Understood. Take me to him. The palace's inner sanctum had been transformed into a state-of-the-art medical facility, its walls lined with flickering crystals that emitted a soft, calming hum. But the air was tense. Emperor Vora lay on a raised platform, his massive reptilian frame motionless, except for shallow, labored breaths. Shards of crystalline debris jutted from his body at grotesque angles. A ring of Sascar medics and elders stood around him, their expressions a mix of fear, disdain, and fragile hope. Marsden approached with measured steps, joined by Kara Lynn, his second in command, who carried a tray of sterilized surgical tools. Vitals, he asked, his voice low. Critical but stable, Kara replied, her tone clipped and professional. The largest shard is lodged near his primary heart chamber. Moving it could trigger a catastrophic bleed. Then we'll have to be quick and precise, Marsden said, his eyes never leaving the Emperor's battered form.
Ralden's voice cut through the tense quiet. Know that every moment you delay is a moment closer to his death, human. Marsden didn't respond, He was already scrubbing in, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. Scalpel, he said, extending his hand. Kara placed the tool into his gloved palm without hesitation.
He made the first incision, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Marsden's movements were deliberate, his focus unbreakable. He worked methodically, extracting shards one by one while staunching blood loss and carefully stitching torn arteries. The Emperor's body was a battlefield of internal injuries, each step fraught with peril. Kara worked alongside him, her hands steady as she monitored vitals, handed instruments, and preemptively adjusted tools as Marsden required.
The sascar watched from a sterile observation dome above, their eyes glistening with tension. For them, the sight of their ruler's open body was anathema, a grotesque violation of their beliefs about bodily integrity. Some turned away, unable to stomach it. Others watched, transfixed by a mixture of horror and desperate hope.
Midway through the procedure, the heart monitor let out a piercing, irregular tone. The Emperor's primary heart had begun to fail. Marsden acted immediately, clamping off a major artery and signaling to Kara. Adrenaline injection. Now. Kara administered the injection, and Marsden's hands moved with furious precision. "Come on," he muttered, his voice low but determined. "Not on my table." Ralden's hiss echoed from the observation dome. "What is happening, human?" Marsden didn't look up. Complications. Stabilizing. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he worked to repair the damage. He made micro-adjustments to the Emperor's circulatory system, sealing ruptures and reinforcing damaged tissues. The heart rate steadied, weak but holding. An eternity seemed to pass, but Marsden knew he couldn't rest. The largest shard remained a jagged spike lodged dangerously close to the Emperor's central nerve cluster. If mishandled, it would sever critical connections, killing Vora instantly. Marsden inhaled slowly, his hands trembling from exertion. "This is the hardest part," he murmured to Kara. "Once we extract this, there's no room for error."
Understood, Kara replied, adjusting the instruments and setting the laser cauterizer to stand by.
Time slowed as Marsden carefully grasped the shard. He visualized every motion, every millimeter of movement, before gently pulling. The shard resisted. Blood began to pool. He shifted his grip, adjusting pressure, and pulled again. Finally, it slid free, and blood gushed from the wound.
"Cauterize," Marsden said, his voice steady but urgent. Kara moved with precision, sealing the wound. Marsden quickly sutured the area, restoring stability to the Emperor's fragile system. When he stepped back, his shoulders ached, and his vision swam with exhaustion, but the worst was over. "It's done," he announced, his voice hoarse. "Now we wait."
For 48 agonizing hours, Marsden and Kara monitored the Emperor's recovery. The sascar elders and officials barely left the observation dome, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and vigilance. At times, the Emperor's condition faltered, his vitals spiking and dipping unpredictably. Marsden intervened as needed, pushing himself to the brink of collapse. Then, finally, Emperor Vora's eyes opened. His gaze was unfocused but aware. He drew a deep, ragged breath and spoke one word: gratitude. Relief swept through the room. The sascar officials erupted into a cacophony of hissing cheers and tears. Ralden descended from the observation dome, his eyes fixed on Marsden. "You saved him." Marsden's hands still trembled from exertion. "I did my job."
Ralden regarded him with a mixture of awe and wariness. "Your methods. They are still unsettling."
But effective, Marsden countered, too tired to argue further. Ralden nodded slowly. "We will remember this." As the sascar tended to their recovering Emperor, Marsden and Kara finally allowed themselves to step away. The weight of what they had accomplished settled over them. They had not just saved a life, they had cracked open the door to change. In the days that followed, the sascar issued a statement acknowledging the critical role of human intervention. Across the galaxy, reactions were divided. Some praised the human skill and resilience. Others, particularly the staunchest traditionalists, remained adamant that such practices should never be normalized. Marsden returned to Earth exhausted but resolute. The fight for acceptance had taken a small but significant step forward. He knew the galaxy's opinion wouldn't change overnight, but for now, a life had been saved, and that was enough. Dr. William Marsden's work on Drellian Prime had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed like things might change, that centuries-old prejudices about human surgical methods would finally give way to reason and results. But the galaxy, with all its complexity, resisted change in fits and starts. No sooner had the sascar acknowledged the human team's life-saving work than debates reignited across the Galactic Command. On the human side, Marsden became an instant hero. News networks portrayed him as the blade of hope, a symbol of humanity's perseverance in the face of skepticism and scorn. His inbox overflowed with messages of gratitude from people across the galaxy, some whose lives he had directly saved, others who admired his willingness to challenge deeply entrenched traditions. But there was no shortage of detractors, either. In one particularly scathing broadcast, a prominent commentator from the Thrillarian Alliance, a species known for their devotion to non-invasive nanotechnology, declared, "This so-called victory marks a dangerous precedent. Today it is an emperor, tomorrow it will be our own children subjected to the blade." Marsden tried to tune out the noise, but it was impossible to ignore completely. Even on Earth, he found himself navigating the fraught line between being a hero and a pariah. The reality of this new, divided reputation struck home when a distress signal came in from Tyranus V. The message was bleak: a catastrophic failure of their planet's water purification system had resulted in mass contamination. Thousands of Tyranians were experiencing acute organ failure. Conventional methods, nanites, molecular reweaving, and advanced synthetic biorepair were either too slow or ineffective against the complex nature of the toxins. The Tyranian High Council, after exhausting every other avenue, reluctantly sent out a call for help. The message reached Marsden through a convoluted chain of diplomatic channels. He read it in his quarters, the words heavy on the display: "We require human surgical intervention." The atmosphere on Tyranus V was dire. Marsden and a hand-picked team of 12 human surgeons stepped off their transport and into chaos. The landing platform overlooked a sprawling medical facility hastily assembled to handle the crisis. Tyranians, humanoid but with a distinct bluish-gray skin tone and ridged cranial structures, lay on cots, their labored breaths and hollow eyes telling a story of suffering. Lyris, a senior Tyranian official with a gaunt face and tired eyes, met Marsden with a guarded expression. "You came," he said, as if still unsure of his own desperation. "We have no other options." Marsden nodded, his face solemn. "We'll do everything we can." The human team moved quickly, setting up triage and assessing the patient's needs. The situation was grim. Many of the afflicted were in advanced stages of organ failure. Kara Lynn and other team members worked to match donors, prepare surgical bays, and calm frightened families. Marsden could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him with every step he took. He knew that every move would be scrutinized, every success celebrated, and every failure magnified.
The first procedure involved a middle-aged Tyranian with severe kidney damage. Marsden led the operation personally, removing the contaminated organ and replacing it with a bioengineered graft. His hands moved with relentless precision, sealing veins and arteries, flushing toxins from the bloodstream, and ensuring the graft took hold. The operation was a success, but it was only the beginning.
Day after day, Marsden's team worked around the clock. They performed heart transplants, reconstructed failing livers, and repaired torn tissue using a combination of traditional and innovative techniques. The Tyranian medics watched with a mix of fascination, horror, and growing respect. Some murmured among themselves, unable to look away from the sight of open bodies and glistening organs. Others, initially repelled, found themselves drawn to the human methods out of sheer necessity. On the fourth day, Lyris approached Marsden as he washed blood from his hands, exhaustion carving lines into his face. "You have saved many," Lyris said. There was a long pause, filled only by the faint hum of medical machinery. But not all. Marsden met his gaze, knowing there were no words that could truly address the losses. "I know. I wish we could." "There are those among us," Lyris said slowly, "who believe this crisis is the price we pay for accepting your methods." Marsden's jaw tightened. "I've heard the whispers." They say the blade invites death, even as it tries to stave it off. Marsden turned off the water and dried his hands, the exhaustion replaced by a quiet resolve. You're wrong. The blade isn't what brings death. It's what gives people a fighting chance against it. Laris said nothing, but his eyes spoke of internal conflict. Over the following week, the human team performed hundreds of surgeries. Each one was a battle against time, against a toxin that seemed to adapt and resist. Marsden's body ached, his mind burned from exhaustion. Yet he pressed on. By the time the crisis stabilized, they had saved thousands, but not everyone. The High Council of Tyrannus V publicly acknowledged their gratitude to the human medics, though it was tempered by caution. While we cannot ignore the lives saved, the official statement read, we remain wary of these methods. The scars may heal, but their mark is indelible.
For many Tyrrhenians, the human surgeons became unlikely heroes. Families who had nearly lost loved ones came forward, offering thanks and seeking to understand the ways of those they had once feared. But not everyone was convinced. Protests erupted in certain sectors, with demonstrators carrying signs depicting crude drawings of blades and open bodies, chanting, "No more scars. No more blades."
Back on Earth, Marsden tried to recover, both physically and emotionally. The successes were undeniable, but the pushback was exhausting. He spent long hours reflecting on the deep-rooted fears and traditions that ran through the galaxy. Change, he realized, would come slowly, painfully so. His brief respite was interrupted when a glowing delegation from Neolith 9 appeared at Earth's diplomatic hub. Calirus, the Neolith leader Marsden had sparred with before, floated toward him, their gaseous form flickering. One of our own suffers from a rare core rupture, Calirus said, their voice quivering. We have exhausted every molecular and energetic solution. We need you? Marsden studied the shifting hues of the Neolith leader, sensing the struggle it had taken to come here. I'll do everything I can, he said simply. The Neolith led him to a specially prepared chamber. Inside, Marsden saw his patient, a high-ranking Neolith named Raylan, whose form pulsed weakly, their energy field unstable. It was a race against time. Marsden quickly adapted his approach, blending surgical precision with new tools calibrated for the Neolith physiology. Every adjustment, every incision felt like stepping into unknown territory. But hours passed. Marsden worked tirelessly, his every movement watched by Neolith dignitaries whose anxiety was displayed through bursts of color. At one critical moment, Raylan's core flickered dangerously, and the room erupted in a low hum of panic. Calm, Marsden said, his voice firm. I need focus. With Kara's help, he stabilized Raylan's core, manipulating their internal structure with tools designed just hours prior. Sweat soaked his back, but he pressed on. At last, the core steadied, its glow bright and unwavering. It's done, Marsden announced, sagging with exhaustion. Calirus approached, their form shifting to a radiant gold, a sign of profound relief. You have our gratitude, Dr. Marsden. Marsden nodded, too tired to speak. The weight of what they had just accomplished pressed on him. The Neolith had sought his help, an unthinkable step for a species that once dismissed human methods outright. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Galactic Command was forced to confront the implications of Marsden's successes. Species that once scorned human methods now found themselves grappling with a new reality. The debate grew louder, but so did the support for change.
But not all were swayed. On the icy world of Kelraden, traditionalist factions issued a decree banning all human surgical interventions. To them, the blade represented everything they feared, a disruption of their beliefs and customs.
Marsden wanted no part in political battles. But when an accident trapped dozens of miners beneath ice and rock on Kelraden, and no other methods could reach them, the Council of Elders sent a desperate plea. Dr. William Marsden stood at the edge of a vast, ice-ridden expanse on Kelraden, his breath forming visible puffs in the frigid air. Snowflakes swirled around him, driven by biting winds that seemed to pierce through every layer of thermal insulation. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving, a perfect reflection of the Kelraden people's rigid adherence to tradition. Yet today, that tradition had cracked, if only slightly, under the weight of desperation. The Council of Elders had begrudgingly called for his help after an unprecedented mining accident buried dozens of their own under tons of ice and rock. For centuries, the Kelradin had rejected human surgical practices, viewing them as primitive and abhorrent. Now, however, Marsden was their last hope. A stern-faced elder named Garin, who led the traditionalist faction, met Marsden with icy eyes and stiff formality. "You know the terms, human. Do what must be done, but remember our customs are not forgotten." Marsden nodded curtly, understanding the subtext. If he failed or overstepped, their tentative acceptance would shatter. "Understood," he said. The rescue site was a chaotic blur of activity. Teams worked frantically to clear debris, revealing battered and broken Kelradin miners beneath. Marsden and his team quickly set up makeshift surgical stations, knowing they had precious little time. Carolyn coordinated logistics, her breath fogging in the cold air as she directed medics and secured emergency equipment. "First patient incoming," she announced. "Crushed legs and suspected internal bleeding." Marsden moved immediately, his senses sharpening. The patient, a young Kelradin named Taran, was barely conscious, his pale skin tinged with blue from the cold and shock. Marsden quickly assessed the injuries. Both legs were shattered, and internal bleeding threatened his life. He glanced at Garin, who hovered nearby, his expression rigid. "To save him, I may have to amputate," Marsden said. Garin's face tightened, and for a moment Marsden feared he would refuse. "You do what you must," Garin said finally, his voice brittle. "But know that we will not forget this."
Marsden nodded, wasting no time. "Scalpel," he said, and Kara placed the instrument in his hand. He made a precise incision, working quickly to stem the bleeding and stabilize Taran's vitals. The procedure was a delicate dance of cutting and cauterizing, each movement deliberate and decisive. When he removed the damaged tissue and sealed the wounds, Marsden felt the eyes of every nearby Kelradin on him, their expressions a mix of revulsion and reluctant respect.
Hours passed, and Marsden's team worked tirelessly, performing emergency amputations, internal repairs, and complex reconstructions. The cold seeped into their bones, but they pressed on, driven by the urgency of the lives at stake. For some of the injured miners, the damage was too extensive, and Marsden had to make the hardest call of all to let them go. Those moments weighed heavily on him, each loss a reminder of the limits of even the most skilled hands. But for many others, there was hope. One critical moment came with a patient whose spine had been crushed. Marsden knew the risks. "If I proceed, there's no guarantee he'll walk again," he said to Garin. "But I can save his life." "Do what," Garin said, his voice a harsh whisper. The procedure was long and harrowing. Marsden's hands moved with unerring precision as he worked to stabilize the spine, realign damaged nerves, and prevent further collapse. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he never faltered. When he finally stepped back, the patient's vitals were steady, and Marsden allowed himself a brief moment of relief. In the days that followed, Marsden and his team continued their work. Slowly, the tide began to shift. Kelradin, who had once spat at the sight of human surgical tools, now watched with wary curiosity. Families of saved miners approached Marsden, offering quiet words of thanks. One older Kelradin even pressed a small, carved stone into Marsden's hand, a symbol of their people's deepest gratitude. Garin, too, seemed changed. Though his demeanor remained cold, he no longer spoke with the same rigid hostility. One evening, he approached Marsden as the surgeon tended to his aching hands by the warmth of a makeshift fire. "Our ways are not so easily changed," Garin said, his voice low. "But you have done more for our people than we could have imagined." "I only did what needed to be done," Marsden replied, his eyes tired but resolute. "I'd do it again." Garin nodded slowly. "Perhaps. There is room for more than one way." Word of the events on Kelradin spread quickly. Across the galaxy, the debate around human surgical practices intensified. For every species that acknowledged their value, another raised concerns about tradition, ethics, and what it meant to accept such invasive methods. But it was clear that something fundamental had shifted. When all else failed, the blade became a symbol of last hope. Marsden found himself at the center of this maelstrom, a reluctant ambassador for change. He received invitations to speak at medical summits, some genuine, others designed to challenge and provoke. At one particularly contentious gathering, a Thrillarian delegate sneered, "Do you revel in opening bodies, human? Is that your pride?" Marsden met the accusation with quiet strength. "I take no pride in the act itself, but I do take pride in saving lives. If that makes you uncomfortable, then so be it." Over time, more species approached Marsden with requests for training in emergency surgical techniques. Some were driven by pragmatism, others by fear of being left behind. The galaxy was vast and stubborn, but even it could not ignore results forever. The true turning point came when Galactic Command convened a special summit. The chamber was as full as it had been during their first meeting, but the tone was different, more hesitant, more respectful. Valoon, who had once led the charge against human methods, addressed the assembly. "Dr. Marsden has demonstrated, time and again, that human surgical practices can save lives when nothing else can," she said, her luminous form dimmed with thoughtful gravity. "While we cannot ignore the complexity and controversy of these methods, we must also acknowledge their value. It is time to integrate these practices not as a replacement, but as a complement to our own." The vote that followed was close but historic. Human surgical methods were no longer relegated to emergency-only status. They would be accepted as part of the galaxy's broader medical framework, subject to oversight and collaboration. Marsden returned to Earth weary but hopeful. The battle was not over, but it had reached a milestone. He knew there would still be skeptics, still be prejudice. But lives had been saved, barriers had been breached, and understanding tentative and fragile had begun to grow. 1 week later, as he prepared to train a coalition of alien medics in emergency surgical techniques, Marsden allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The galaxy was vast, its cultures and beliefs deeply entrenched. But even in the face of fear and tradition, life had a way of breaking down barriers, one cut, one stitch, one life at a time. With a tired but determined smile, he stepped forward, ready for whatever came next.